Hello and welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about common interests, share knowledge and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Antonia and today I'm joined by Laura and Jasmin to talk about metals that are used in technology, what exactly we're using and how critical they are for modern life. So Laura, this was a topic that you suggested. What about metals got your attention?
Probably nearly 10 years ago now, when I was still doing research at the University of Manchester, I went to a lot of conferences. Some of the conferences, they were quite broad, so some of the sessions weren't necessarily directly related to my work. So I came across a lot of talks that were talking about uses of different metals in different technologies like smartphones and solar panels and all sorts of different things. And it just kind of really opened my eyes to how natural resources are used and what they're used for. And there is some really wild chemistries out there that you'd never have thought of that end up in materials that end up in our homes.
It's actually kind of similar to when I was researching in my postgraduate studies about the energy industry and whether or not we have enough material to reach net zero, which is the target for minimizing adverse effects from climate change. And Jasmin, you are still working in this kind of field now. What about criticality of materials is an interest for you in sustainability?
One of the areas of my research is something called life cycle assessment, it's a holistic environmental impact assessment methodology. And typically in life cycle assessment, you compare different indicators like climate change, water scarcity, etc. And something that I've found quite common in my research when I've been looking at low carbon or decarbonization technologies versus fossil fuels is that the low carbon options have typically like much higher metals and mineral demands versus the fossil fuels. So obviously, if we're going to be like decarbonizing and using a lot more renewable energy, a lot more battery storage, whether or not we have the metals and minerals needed to make these things is going to be like crucially important in terms of whether or not we actually successfully transition to a fully renewable energy system.
That's a really important point. Essentially, we kind of want to move away from fossil fuels because they are non-renewable resources. But if we are using different materials in a unsustainable way, such as metals and minerals, then it's not really solving the problem. We still kind of have an unsustainable future. I think to sort of start off with, let's talk about what kind of materials are important in this field.
I'm sure most people are like familiar with stuff like aluminium and steel and iron, but there are also lots of different metals and materials used in making wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, etc. Yeah, there's like lots of different metals that are really important for like these different technologies. So for example, like cobalt, lithium, platinum.
So for the energy industry, there are a few that they don't seem particularly exotic to me. They're quite familiar. Gold, nickel, and lithium. We did a podcast episode on lithium a few years ago. It's specifically about electric vehicles and whether there is really enough lithium out there to help support this growing demand for batteries in the vehicles. And we never really answered that question. But what was interesting was the way that lithium is extracted from various countries doesn't sound all that sustainable to me.
Nope. Lithium, as I'm sure you've been taught in like secondary school chemistry, it's a really reactive chemical. So like you need to, when you're extracting it...
So reactive, like a bark.
Yeah, like a bark from a dog.
Well timed there, Smudge.
It's really reactive, so obviously you need to make sure it doesn't come in contact with any water because then that would be quite bad. When you mine it, there's like specific processes that you have to use. And in like some, maybe like lithium mining, it's actually a co-product or a byproduct when you're mining other metals, so like aluminium or nickel. I know that for aluminium nickel mining, you definitely produce cobalt as a byproduct. So an aspect of like mining for metals is like whether or not the resource is like the main product that you're trying to extract or just like a co-product that would sometimes then be sent to like waste, or whether or not it's something that we would want to like actually go about recovering. But because lithium is such an important metal nowadays, because there's like a really big demand for battery storage for like electric vehicles, but also for like smartphones, laptops, and also like large scale battery storage for grid electricity, like when we're seeing more dedicated lithium mines now.
One of the reports by the International Energy Agency said that over the next 2 decades, the demand for lithium for energy is going to be about 90%.
Yeah.
When I looked at some old statistics from the US Geological Society, they look at sort of overall in the world, how much reserves we have and how much is being mined each year. In 2017, 48% of the end use for lithium was towards batteries. And last year it was 87%. So that already is kind of hitting that total share of the demand. So we're going to have to rapidly upscale the sort of mining operations, which also means extracting more material out of the earth to get what is going to be mixed in to the minerals and into the solid. It's going to be interesting to see how quickly we can do that, because we need rapid decarbonisation, not just eventually.
Yeah. I would also add on to that, I think it's more like reason to put more efforts into better ways of trying to recycle lithium, because currently very little lithium in lithium-ion batteries is actually recycled. And obviously a lot of it's going into like just going for waste disposal. So if we could find ways of recovering the lithium, then that would really help out in terms of like reducing the additional amount that we need to mine. Either that, or we find a new battery technology that doesn't use a metal like lithium that is hard to recycle and kind of not that common.
Well, I think lithium actually is quite abundant in the earth. It's just
It's difficult to extract.
Exactly. When I was doing my studies, I looked at lithium-ion batteries, and actually the chemistry of the battery determined how easy it was to recycle, or should I say, how economical it was to recycle. There was a popular, cheaper chemistry, lithium manganese oxide, which people preferred because it was cheaper to make because of the manganese. But because of that compound, people actually were less inclined to recycle it compared to lithium cobalt. So even the design of what you're going to use matters.
So I find it crazy that you would make something that you then can't recover the resources from. Because you've already put all the effort into getting it out of the ground, right? So why wouldn't you want to retain it?
Entropy. My thought is everything tends towards entropy. Everything turns to a mess. How much more effort it is to try and tidy that up compared to just getting it fresh.
But surely getting it fresh is still an effort sort of against entropy, because it's distributed kind of randomly through parts of the earth.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there are some companies that have started to get into the circular economy vibe. I don't know about any electronics ones that do it, but I knew clothing manufacturers that do. They take back their products at the end and then remake it into something. I think that should be the same for electronics.
There is stuff for electronics, it just depends on the type of electronics. So for batteries, it's still very limited just because the actual technology to extract the lithium is still very early stages. But there's like technologies for like recycling other types of electronics, like circuit boards.
There are challenges with that as well. So one of the reasons that electronics are becoming more and more efficient and smaller is because they're using a greater diversity of elements from the periodic table, which makes them more complicated, which then makes it more difficult to separate things out again.
Yeah. Easier to mix things up than it is to pull them apart, I guess.
Apparently. I just think it needs more effort to design those processes. I think companies have been so fixated on making a product and designing stuff to make something that they've not thought about designing a process to recycle something.
Yeah, and I guess it's not to go too much into sort of policy and legislation, but that is something that is discussed in sort of like the European Parliament about the producer responsibility, how much of it is down to the end user to make it back to recycling, or is it down to the maker and designer to make sure it can be recycled or reused or returned back to them to actually make a brand new one. I think there are some good projects where people have found, incentivizing people to return stuff, like smartphones, that take back scheme. If you trade in your old phone, you get some money off your new phone. That actually helps get people to not just hoard the valuable metals that are in electronics. But like Jasmin said, I think batteries are like lithium-ion batteries in particular are still harder to recycle compared to like which used to be more standard was lead acid. and you kind of crack it open, pour out the acid, and you have leftover lead.
That sounds so pleasant.
Yeah, really pleasant industry.
But you guys also mentioned gold as well. I know so little about the energy industry. Is gold a particularly important chemical element for energy?
Because gold's a precious metal, there's just always demand. So when you add in more demand, it really just increases the price. So I think in terms of like gold scarcity, it's really more from an economic perspective, because like gold is literally a marker of like how things are going economically. So when the price of gold goes up, things are like really going downhill.
Again, I dug around for some statistics about gold, and for use in technology and electronics, it's about 15% of the share. Like 50% was jewelry, and then the other large proportion was for currency in banks. So people literally being able to trade or being able to say, we have this much money in reserve at the bank. So, I mean, gold is like a really good like semiconductor, but we couldn't possibly afford to use it all the time. So that's why we don't. But in like applications where it's really important, you can and justify the cost in it. But interestingly, gold and aluminium were some more recycled materials. So one of your complaints, Laura, was why don't people not recycle these things more? Is because it's not an established sort of value, and the supply chain being available for it.
All right. So gold, because it's of value to other industries like banking, is more desirable.
Yeah, so
if you made everything out of gold.
Yeah, I would also add in that, not too sure about aluminium, but gold is definitely easier to recycle because it's not a very reactive metal. So if you just melt it, that's all you really need to do.
Is aluminium easy to recycle? Because it's got such a... It's like really difficult to make, isn't it, into pure aluminium?
If you do have like good sources of scrap aluminium, it's really easy to recycle because you just need to melt it. But in terms of like if you have aluminium mixed in with other things, so like for example, you've got some tinfoil but it's got like food on it, you need to like scrape the food off before you can recycle the aluminium.
Would it not just burn off?
It depends on like other things, or like whether or not that's something that is in the recycling facility, or whether or not you need to like remove impurities before they go in, because aluminium's still a reactive metal.
I see. But the good news is 55% of the volume of new aluminium was from recycled aluminium, so it just goes to show there is some circularity in certain things.
Yeah. Very random fun fact. I think it was maybe during Napoleon's time. So it was when they first discovered how to produce aluminium. It was actually worth more than gold.
Whoa.
So like all the aristocrats and people, instead of gold cutlery, they had aluminium cutlery. But then they discovered how to make aluminium cheap.
You could say that about lots of other technologies, like producing high quality steel. That was really difficult way back when, and then a process was created that suddenly made it really accessible.
Yeah. Now it's the basis of a lot of our buildings. I mean, it's the essential to building.
Exactly, and that means it gets used more, right? So I assume this is similar to use in the energy industry. You guys mentioned that shifting to more renewable technologies means more use of more chemical elements, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's the same in electronics. When I was looking into this, I went down so many rabbit holes. There is so many different parts of the periodic table used to make materials for electronic components. So I had to focus it down somehow. And I did come out with what I think is quite a good example of explaining how material science kind of develops. It's a discovery made by IBM a couple of decades ago to improve data density storage in hard disk drives. Apparently, the storage medium is, I think it's platinum, and it holds, zeros and ones that are created by the magnetic charge, whether it's magnetic poles, whether they point one way or another, right? Apparently, they used to lie horizontally on this platinum medium, and they found that by putting a really thin layer of ruthenium, like 3 atoms thick of ruthenium, that made the magnetic charge then flip so it was upright, so they could all stack them closer together. So it led to increased data densities.
Wow.
Yeah, which then led to lots of people wanting to buy ruthenium for the same purpose. And it put this squeeze on the market. The price of ruthenium shot up, and it's since gone back down.
How did they find that out?
I don't think they would tell you because it's a company, so it'll be a secret. But knowing what I know, having spoken to lots of other material scientists about their inventions, sometimes it's a bit of, well, we think these elements might work, let's do a bit of trial and error. Other times it's by complete accident.
Yeah, I wonder what it is about ruthenium that helped it. It's not a transition metal. It's on the bottom row, which I cannot remember. It's like lanthanides and
The lanthanides. I'm not sure I would be able to find anything out because it was created by IBM, but it must affect how the electrons like to sit in the platinum layer. Honestly, if you try and ask me to explain, it's about spin states of electrons and all sorts, and it gets into physics. And we need a physicist to explain it properly, I think.
This was something where I was just like, yeah, I think I can understand as far as it's probably something to do with electrons.
Exactly. And I think beyond that is not for me. I draw the line at certain physics. But I think what's interesting is it is just 3 atoms of ruthenium, right? And that has this profound effect. This very slight change to the material has this really profound effect in the properties of the material. And that happens quite a lot in material science, for electronics in particular, it would seem. They often talk about having like 0.1% doping of a particular element into, say, silicon. And then it creates like this incredible change in how it conducts electrons.
It's similar in alloys as well, where putting in that slightly different shaped or size atom amongst otherwise homogeneous layer kind of makes it stronger than if it was just all the same. So sort of like carbon steel or stainless steel.
There are thousands of grades of steel.
Yeah. And something else that got me about ruthenium as well is we're talking about whether it's critical for technology. And I think one component of that is, well, where does it come from and how secure is that supply? According to a report from Birmingham University about technology critical materials for the UK, 93% of all production of ruthenium comes from one country, South Africa, which I was quite surprised at. It's one of the most concentrated sources of a particular element looking at their map. And I just thought, so we're all relying on this one nation for this single element that is not just used in hard drives, it's used in lots of other things as well.
South Africa is also the biggest resource of platinum, another important metal.
It is in like catalytic converters and also any other times when you want a platinum metal, group metal, hydrogen fuel cells. Yeah, again, very essential for the modern world.
Yep.
Same seems to be true for ruthenium as well. I guess it's probably, you could say a similar story about just about anything on the periodic table, I think. Apparently ruthenium is used exclusively in China, it would seem, as a catalyst to make a precursor to nylon.
Okay.
Oh.
Someone did tell me that they have done a deal with South Africa to get a lot of their resources in exchange for helping them build infrastructure. I have no idea how true that is. It's third-hand information. But if they want the ruthenium, then there you go.
And the platinum.
That was an interesting thing when I was looking into the criticality, is like, is it just about the volume or is it about the supply chain and how robust it is? When I was looking at just the UK and how much metal they would need for decarbonisation, certain metals you'd be like, oh, that's just a drop in the ocean. And other ones, even just the UK would swing the balance so much. And so is it about how much is actually available versus how much is available on the market?
Yeah, I'd say it's a combination of both. I mean, technically there's no standard definition for like what is a critical material or metal, because different countries have different criteria and different countries have different lists of what metals and minerals they consider critical. So for example, I think it's in Japan, zinc is considered critical, but in Australia it's not, and I think also in the UK zinc is not considered critical. So it really depends. Like, yeah, obviously, like with lots of countries decarbonising is going to put an increased strain on availability and resources for these different metals and materials. So like not even like the ones that we've been talking about, like the ruthenium, cobalt, lithium, but also stuff like copper, which is fairly common, but like copper is the metal that is used to transmit electricity. So when you have a new power plant, you need to use copper cables to hook it up. You also use copper in like overhead railway lines. So sometimes if your train's being delayed and they're saying it's because someone's been trying to steal the metal from the tracks, it's usually because someone's been trying to steal the copper from the tracks. So yeah, it's going to depend on a lot on like demand and whether or not there's just like enough to meet demand. And from what I've read, people are like fairly confident that there should be enough. It's just we're going to have to like go to like different ways of mining. So a lot of like the rarer metals, they're more co-products or byproducts from when you're mining other metals. So more efforts to like recover those waste metals, but also we're going to see more efforts put into like recycling metals, because we can't just send everything to like landfill or to a waste facility when it's very valuable.
No, but then I think there's even the talk of landfill mining, which is finding stuff from a landfill to then treat, like those cables that were found from the train line. They just came from a landfill, right? They weren't just stolen off a live train track.
Talking about what defines a critical metal, and it depends on where you are and what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think for some applications, there can be so many different ways to have the same end result that it almost doesn't really matter which element you're using. For example, smartphones use a ridiculous number of elements, some of them. And one of them that's mentioned by a few sources is yttrium. It's a very well-known element, of course. And this is used to create a particular type of colour in your LED display. And I think it is often combined with europium, and then when a current is passed through it, it emits a red light, so it gives a red colour. But from what I can tell, there are like a dozen different ways to do this, and you don't necessarily need to use yttrium. Whether one is more efficient than another, I don't know. I feel like we could do an entire episode just on how to make LEDs glow different colours, because the chemistry out there is vast. But I presume it's relatively simple to substitute yttrium for something else. And according to the American Chemical Society, they have defined it as a relatively risky supply product in the future. It's quite low risk on their scale, though. There are other more critical minerals, I guess.
Well, speaking of other materials, our previous episode was on nanoparticles, and we did discuss how you could make different coloured particles, including replacing LEDs with quantum dots. So there you go. But still using some rather unusual metals like indium.
It's true. So that's a good point, actually. It's not just the composition, it's how big it is as well, has a massive effect. And indium, seeing as you mentioned it, funnily enough, I really like this example. It's used to make your touchscreen responsive, so it makes it actually useful rather than just being a display you can do out there. It basically, as indium tin oxide allows the current to flow, and it creates contacts, so when you press it together, the current flows, right? But this technology has been around for like decades, I think since the 1970s.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember using touchscreens when I was a lot younger, and they weren't as responsive as they are now. So technology has definitely improved.
Yeah, it's the difference between what they called resistive, where you could use anything that created some sort of physical contact, versus now where it's capacitive, that it has to be certain materials which can pass through a current.
And I think the resistive ones had very different chemistry, which I don't know enough about because I haven't researched it yet.
No, I think we could spend a lot of time researching all the exotic materials and how they work.
Yeah, and the thickness of this layer, it's a bit thicker than the ruthenium example. It's more than a few atoms, but it's still quite tiny. It's 100 times thinner than a human hair, according to one research paper that I read.
Wow.
Because of its use in smartphones that aren't necessarily recycled. And you mentioned hoarding of smartphones. I definitely have done this in the past, Antonia.
Me too.
Yeah, me too.
But because of increased use in things like smartphones, again, demand is going up, so it's becoming more of a critical mineral. I think it's also used in solar panels, I believe, to make the electrodes either side of the layer that produces the current.
Not in the most commonly used material. So currently, most solar panels are made of crystalline silicon, and they'll have like silver or gold contacts as well as copper. I say newer inverted commas, the developing technology is thin film. It's still way too expensive for most people to use, so it's in very niche applications, basically. But yeah, indium, gallium.
The advantage of the indium tin oxide is it's one of the few materials that is both conductive and optically transparent, so it'll let light pass through, which is why it's used in your smartphone, and I guess why they're looking at it for solar panels.
Chemistry is wild. It does so many things.
Yeah, and materials scientists or materials chemists seem to be finding more and more or different things all the time, different applications and different properties and different ways of combining chemical elements together to make new things, which could help get over the whole the critical elements idea if you can find another element that works just as well, or a different chemistry and size of particular thing you're creating. I think we talked about quantum dots in the nanoparticles episode.
Yeah, I don't have a follow-up for that one, sorry. To change topic a bit, so we've talked about mining sort of on the Earth. Something that people have talked about is mining on the moon. So we've sort of spoken about space tourism before, but what are your thoughts on mining the moon for more resource?
Well, there's already a company who are looking into mining on the moon. So, like, the moon, in theory, does have a lot of, like, metals and minerals that we have on Earth, but like something that the moon might have more in abundance is something called helium-3. It's a particular type of isotope of helium, and it's particularly useful because you can cool it down to like really low temperatures, which makes it an ideal coolant for quantum computers. And obviously, as we become more advanced and like have more data to process, we're going to be having more quantum computers. So more quantum computers, we need more helium-3. We're running out of it on Earth, so we need to go to the moon.
Is there a way we can artificially make helium-3?
Probably, but mining on the moon sounds cooler.
Oh, I don't know. It can probably be produced in a nuclear reaction, though.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. I like the question that just appeared from the audience about how expensive is it to mine on the moon. That was exactly my thought as well. Surely it's easier and cheaper to just do it on Earth.
Yeah.
Even if it's a difficult to access resource, right?
This is what it says from Cosmos magazine. It's very expensive to take materials to the moon. The SLS, for example, just a rocket costs 24 billion. The launch cost 2 billion. The current rates to get 1 kilogram material to the moon cost around 1.5 million. And that doesn't include trying to get stuff back from the moon. So it's going to be very expensive.
Yeah, so millions, maybe even billions of pounds.
Yeah.
But at least helium-3 is going to be pretty light.
Yeah.
You'll get a lot of it. You compress it.
You have to figure out how to get it back, though, yeah, and compressing it. Well, then it's not so light, is it?
No.
I don't know.
No.
I think they're just appealing to rich people that have too much money. And as you say, Jasmin, mining on the moon is cool.
Yeah, it sounds cool. Yeah, there's like another figure floating around that lunar resources could top 1 quadrillion in value. So yeah, potentially big money if you're a billionaire looking to invest your money in other ways.
I suppose it's that novelty, isn't it, that draws people to it. And the fact that if you kind of start it first, you might have the best advantage to monopolise.
Yeah, for sure, but you still have to get a business plan that actually works and doesn't end in bankruptcy.
I feel like we should maybe do a follow-up episode on the composition of the moon. And if you did mine all the apparently useful resources from it, how much would its mass decrease? And then what would that mean for life on Earth?
Oh my gosh, yeah. If it changes the tidal patterns on Earth.
We could all die.
Well, that's just a new way for us to become extinct.
Just add it to the list. Climate change.
Mining on the moon.
Yeah.
There are other metals and minerals. It's just helium-3 is the one that people are actually interested in because there's just not enough available. It's a coolant for quantum computers.
But then, so by obtaining this helium-3, we're enabling a new technology which presumably will put more of a pressure on the natural resources from Earth, right? So it's just kind of compounding this problem that I think Antonia mentioned right near the start of we're replacing fossil fuels with renewables, still relying on a finite resource.
Yeah.
We're just shifting the problem. We're not really solving anything.
Nope.
But to play devil's advocate, the need to decarbonise is very steep. So is it worth kicking the can down the road for a different problem later on?
My dog Smudge agrees with that, apparently.
Yeah, very, very venomously.
It's just a question. It's like, what happens if the helium-3 leaks when coming down to the Earth? In terms of like we don't get enough helium-3 from the moon, there'll be a very big loss in profits to whoever's mining on the moon. But in terms of whether or not it's going to have any negative impacts on the environment, probably not.
No, it's an inert gas, isn't it?
And it's in space.
Yeah, it's in space also. If it's like leaking in the atmosphere, in the approach to the atmosphere, it's probably just going to disintegrate. The atmosphere is actually very good at protecting us from asteroids and stuff because it just burns anything that enters into the atmosphere.
But if there's a significant leak when it's coming down, this is my my undergrad in physics playing in here. I did some astronomy modules. It would throw the trajectory of your rocket ship off course. How difficult does that make the landing then?
You won't land exactly where you're supposed to land, but hopefully if you're meant to be landing on water, you still land on water and not on solid ground.
But maybe it completely the wrong trajectory.
Or you land in enemy territory.
Ooh, and they get all your helium-3.
For their own quantum computing needs.
Yes.
I think we've gone quite far off topic. So this seems like a good place to leave it, but I think we've learned and discussed a bit about how critical materials are in decarbonisation due to their volume and taking up the share of the current production, but also how useful it is in electronics, like our smartphones, quantum computers, just getting more data stored into the same volume, so making smaller storage, data storage, all useful for our modern life. So thank you for listening, and we hope to see you in the next episode.
The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.